Good morning. This is Cindy Hirschberg interviewing Mr. George Murphy, who's been a Carroll County resident since 1993 and an avid researcher into Carroll County history. Today is Saturday, May 16th, 2009. Good morning, George.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you for being with us this morning. We're going to continue our conversations about African American history in Carroll County, and I wanted to ask if you could characterize the period of time after the American Civil War and what was going on in race relations here in the county.
In Carroll County, with the end of the Civil War, that was the end of the plantation system. And the Emancipation Proclamation, which applied to the 11 states of the Confederacy after the passing of the 14th Amendment, then applied to Maryland. And all the slaves held in Maryland who are not yet free were freed. And so, with the death of slavery in Carroll County, communities of color sprang up within and outside of towns. And during that era, land-grant colleges were formed, and colleges such as Bowie State College was then called Bowie Normal School, was set up to educate blacks to become teachers. And other land-grant colleges, such as Towson State University, was then called Towson Normal School. And so parallel colleges were set up for blacks and whites, and parallel organizations grew up. And in that era, the educational level of the average citizen also increased because of the explosion of educational institution and a widespread religious revival, which also occurred in Carroll County.
Well, there was no public education in America until after the American Civil War. It was all done privately or in the home. Is that correct?
In most areas, yes. Just in pockets where prosperous people were in Virginia and Massachusetts and elsewhere. But the general idea of public education was pretty new to us. And in fact, Abraham Lincoln had an awful lot to do with the founding of land-grant colleges all across the United States. He was ahead of his time in dozens and dozens and dozens of ways.
Well, I understand your research shows that in this era of when segregation and separate but equal institutions, there were parallel organizations in the African American community and then the white community. Didn't you mention Union soldiers?
Yes. There was an organization of Union veterans authorized by Congress called the Grand Army of the Republic. And that was an organization of veterans who fought for their interests, and that was for white veterans. However, at the same time, there grew up another Grand Army of the Republic. And in New Windsor, the Thaddeus Stevens Post was founded. The Thaddeus Stevens Post of the Grand Army of the Republic. There was even a ladies' colored auxiliary for that post. And so you had white veterans organized in the Grand Army of the Republic, black Union veterans organized in the colored Grand Army of the Republic.
But that separate but equal concept went beyond military service. Didn't you mention the Oddfellows?
Yes. There were civic organizations called, like the Oddfellows. The Oddfellows Hall, which is where Republican Party's headquarters was located, which was the site of all that violence in 1876, had a parallel organization called the Colored Oddfellows. One of the founders of the Ellsworth Cemetery Company was David Ireland, who was an officer in the Colored Oddfellows. I have two articles from 1906 and 1905. From 1905, the entertainment given at Oddfellows Hall, this happens to be the white branch, by the pupils of the high school of the city was a decided success in every particular. The excellent program was rendered in a manner very credible to the participants and also to the instructors by whom they had been thoroughly trained. The hall was filled to overflowing, and numbers of persons were turned away, having been able even to find standing room. And the receipts were very satisfactory. The first regiment band, which happens to be the white municipal band in Westminster, was present and rendered some of its best selections. A request for a repetition of the entertainment has been made by a number of citizens, and it will be repeated again on Monday night, May 15th. The unused tickets sold for the last entertainment will be honored at the door and the doors open at 7:30. From August 3rd, 2006, a few months later, the American Sentinel newspaper, Colored Oddfellows. Brotherly Love Lodge, number 6047, Grand United Order of Oddfellows, is the title of an organization which is quietly doing a good work in its efforts to raise the standard of morality and conduct among the colored people of this city. Its doors, we are informed, are as tightly closed against the turbulent and unruly of every race, but shall promptly open to any who are seeking to find reputable and worthy lives, whatever their past may have been. The Lodge on Saturday afternoon last had a public parade and held a meeting at the Oddfellows Hall, which was largely attended by colored men and women and also by a number of prominent white citizens. A number of the officers of the Grand Lodge of the Order and others from a distance were present, among them 21 swords of the Patriarchy No. 9 of Baltimore, under the command of Captain Harry Franklin, who joined in the public procession. The meeting at the hall was opened with prayer by Reverend Perry G. Walker, and a sermon was delivered by Reverend Johnson, pastor of the Westminster Circuit Colored Methodist Episcopal Church, while addresses were delivered by District Grand Masters Alexander Helmsley, Julius Johnson of Baltimore, District Grand Master Joseph H. Garrett of Arbutus, District Grand Secretary Jesse L. Nichols of Govinstown, District Grand Treasurer Alfred A. Mitchell of Baltimore, District Grand Director John A. Williams of Hagerstown, and Captain Harry Franklin of Baltimore, and Mrs. Mary Burkett of Reisterstown, Governor of the Household of Ruth, number 1484. The exercises were interspersed with music by a choir led by Miss Nettie Walker, organist assisted by Miss Edna Cooper. Miss Walker and Miss Hattie Brightful sang solos. Edward Waller was master of ceremonies. The stage was handsomely decorated with the national colors and otherwise. The officers of the Brotherly Love Lodge are N. G. Thomas, W. Bruce, W. G. Jabez Powell, Executive Secretary Ernest Warfield, Marshal William Morgan, Harold Hardin, Edward Waller, and chaplain was Elmer Cross. The Independent Order of Oddfellows was actually begun in England, probably as early as the 18th century, and it was called the Order of Oddfellows because people would meet not to benefit themselves, but to benefit others. And by having these cultural activities, these musicals, these plays, people would assemble, uplift themselves spiritually and intellectually, and raise money to help others. That's why the Oddfellows were, in fact, the backbone of the Republican Party in Carroll County, and some of the earliest abolitionists as well.
You had mentioned finding something in your research that had to do with union membership?
Yes.
Same concept of separate but equal?
In 1898, which is before the founding of the NAACP, before the founding of the AFL-CIO, there was a drive by the miners, not very far from here, in southern Pennsylvania, to organize and be treated fairly. Mining at that time was a dangerous and deadly occupation. Much as we read about events in China today of miners dying by the scores and sometimes in their hundreds in the mines of China, that bad a working condition and worse was suffered by miners in America. And I would like to read an article about a fatal miners' strike that was printed in the American Sentinel from October 15th, 1898. A fatal battle occurred at Verdun, Illinois on Wednesday between striking miners, detectives, and a train loaded with colored miners from the South. Interrupt the article to say that there was a strategy that you could have separate but equal, but you could use a separate race to break up another's union if it was to the advantage of the owners. 9 miners, 3 deputy detectives were killed, 10 miners and 15 detectives and others were also wounded. The mining company imported the colored men to take the places of the striking miners, who determined to resist the introduction of this species of labor. And when the train carrying 200 dark-skinned laborers reached Verdun, it was fired upon, and a battle ensued between the newcomers and detectives on one side and the strikers on the other. No casualties were reported among the colored men, which is probably to be accounted for by the fact the train bearing them was promptly removed from the scene, and their participation in this strife was of short duration. The fight between the deputies and the strikers, however, continued, with the bloody consequences related. The objection of the miners to the importation of the counter-strikers to take their places does not seem to have been based upon the color of the men, but to the fact that they were not members of the miners' union. Some of the strikers were colored men. State troops are now on the scene of the conflict and order has been restored, but the eventual outcome of the strike cannot be certainly foretold. Probably the miners will fail in their purpose and many of them lose their employment. As to the merits of the cause upon which the strike is based, we are uninformed, but it ought to be possible to adopt some plan by which fair dealing should be maintained between employers and employed. The industrial strategy of the time was to prevent any union from forming at any time for any reason. And if you could use race and segregation to break a union, for some of the mine owners, that was perfectly acceptable. And the death of strikers and the death of your hired detectives was a small price to pay. And if you could bring strike breakers from the South in blocks of black against an integrated union, you could use segregation to defeat the union. Such was the tenor of the times at the end of the 19th century.
Well, the race continued to be a hot issue then. You mentioned something about newspaper coverage of lynchings in the area?
Yes. Prior to the establishment of the NAACP in 1909, the NAACP is 100 years old this year. After, even during, but accelerating after Reconstruction, there was a wide and unfortunate tradition in which white mobs would attack blacks accused of assaults or crimes or murders, and they would never go to trial because white mobs would attack them and lynch them. I've had accounts of white mobs going to the jail in Annapolis, and the article talks about an alleged assault. They would pull this poor man out of the jail in Annapolis, chased him onto the grounds of the State House, and hung him beneath a tree in the shadow of the dome of the State House of Annapolis. And at the end of the article it says, Mr. Burris was known as an honest and industrious man, and thoughts are entertained as to his innocence. At the same time, in Towson, a black man accused of an assault was jailed, and mobs attempted to retrieve him out of jail, and so he was brought to Baltimore City for trial because the court was afraid he would be killed before he could be tried. He was tried and found guilty and then remanded back to Towson. His friends and family were raising money for an appeal because in those days blacks were excluded from the juries in Baltimore County. Although Carroll County had admitted John Baptiste Snowden as a juror in Carroll County as early as 1868, this article, which is from 1908, there were no black jurors in Baltimore County. So when the man arrived back into the Towson jail, before his appeal could be filed, a mob in broad daylight fought the sheriff, got past him, pulled the man out, took him out, and hung him on the spot. And this was fairly widespread and very tragic. And our local Republican Party newspaper was very faithful in recording these type of events. They were sensational. I don't know how they affected readership, but they actually are a fairly accurate record of what was going in Maryland, who we today do not think of as part of the South of the Confederacy, but culturally very much it was like them.
Well, you also said that throughout the state of Maryland, efforts were underway to nullify the 14th Amendment. Is that correct?
Yes, indeed. There was a Senator Gorman and the entire Democratic Party in the era of 1905, 1906, and going up through 1914 when Birth of a Nation became a movie sensation. There was a constant pressure to do away with, as they called it, Negro enfranchisement, where they wanted to prevent blacks from being able to vote ever. I have an article from the American Sentinel, Friday, June 23rd, 2005, an editorial where again...
2005?
1905. Two sides of the question. If the Advocate were infallible, what a set of dishonorable, deceitful rascals, all newspaper editors and other white men who opposed the adoption of the disenfranchising amendment would be. This is the way the Advocate puts it. Quote, the newspaper or white man who opposes the adoption of the proposed amendment favors Negro suffrage, opposes an intelligent electorate, opposes white supremacy, opposes peace and good order, opposes progress and advancement. There is no gainsaying this, and no amount of sophistry and deceit can avoid the allegations. Unquote. Fortunately, the Advocate is not infallible, and there are two sides to the question. This is Mr. Seabrook of Westminster. Men may honestly differ about it, but wittingly or unwittingly, the newspaper or white man who supports the amendment favors a return to Democratic ring rule, graveyard and other false registrations, ballot box stuffing, repeat voting, false counting of votes, legislative corruption and graft, corporations, Senator Gorman, and Gormanism, which, according to the best Carroll County Democratic testimony, denies the people their rights. And it's impossible to say how much more of the reprehensible doings which mark boss rule in this state for so many years. And this is largely the reason why so many Democrats who favor good and honest government oppose the adoption of the amendment of nullification. At this time, with parallel veterans organizations, when this nation went to war in World War I, everybody went to war, blacks and whites. It was the policy in World War I that no regiment organized on the basis of color would receive any medals. The French, and in some cases the British, were the only commanders who gave medals for valor to blacks. And the demands of the nation was that the draft boards would scour the rolls and send off literally hundreds and hundreds of Carroll County residents to war. As they went to war, the same bands that had been organized to play at the Odd Fellows Hall were still alive and well. And I have an account of how the colored draftees were escorted to the train station by the colored municipal band and all cheered and waved them off to war. Further down in the article, a parallel group of white men were going off to war, initially to Fort Dix, and they didn't have, and the Westminster Municipal Band, who was white, didn't know they were going, and how they lamented that they didn't have a band, but they were eager to serve their country. There was a very poignant and touching letter home, and I would like to read it. It's from the American Sentinel, July 26, 1918, entitled Letter from One of Our Colored Boys. One of the founders of Ellsworth Cemetery was a John Adams, and I believe his grandson, Corporal John R. Adams, writing to his mother, Mrs. Grace Adams, Union Street, Westminster, from the American Expeditionary Force, Company H, the 368th Infantry, France. Dear Mother, just a few lines to let you know that I am well, and trust that when you receive this little note, it will find you and grandmother and the rest enjoying the best of health that life can afford. I did not get to see Sterling when I was in Baltimore, and I left word for him to come down to camp. But it is the same, and as I have seen him. When you see Uncle Walker, tell him to get in the game and join the Army. And he will see something worthwhile, as everything is on the level, and no one has to worry about anything, and I am as happy as ever. And I want you to feel the same way, and not to worry about what you hear, as I am not worrying about anything, and things will all run easy here and over there. We have had a very pleasant trip across the Atlantic, and the water was not rough at all. And the boys are as happy as if they were in camp, and we all will write you home folks letters, and hope to hear from you all at some times, as we did in camp. We have had all the fun that one could wish for, and it is our duty to have more fun than the other fellows, because we are all from one place, and we are all have time to have fun. We have the band with us, and is playing good on the ocean. And if there is anything we love better than the blues, it's some more blues. I haven't much to say. Love to all, from your son, John Adams.
Lovely letter.
And it speaks of a son who wants to assuage the fears of his mother.
Reassure her, sure.
And it speaks of the conditions of the time, because he was serving with other young men from Westminster. The way the draft was organized was by communities. And so many of these regiments, everybody knew each other, and they were all from the same place. So World War I was a very, very stressful period of time for everybody's communities. And particularly because at the end of World War I, towards the end of World War I, 1918, as I've noted in the death dates on so many tombstones in Ellsworth Cemetery, hundreds of Carroll Countyans died from the swine flu. It's estimated that 75,000 people at a minimum died in Baltimore City at the close of World War I because of what they called the Spanish or swine influenza. And just recently we've had another outbreak of a influenza. But that influenza had devastating impacts on everybody's community, and I know of 6 tombstones at Ellsworth Cemetery with a 1918 death date, and I am pretty well assured that was because of the influenza.
You had also mentioned that following the Second World War, there was something called the Freedom District. Are you?
Yes, well, historically, Carroll County's election districts are named for geography and events. And there is a Barrett district, there's a Wollersley district named for prominent families and prominent farms, and in southern Carroll County there's a Freedom district. It is named the Freedom district because in southern Carroll County there was the highest concentration of plantations of tobacco farms. And with the manumission of slaves and the Emancipation Proclamation, the Civil War, and the freeing of all the rest of the slaves on these plantations, they formed their own communities. And the Freedom District is named for the freed slaves who formed their own towns in and along Bartholomew Road and on Liberty Road in southern Carroll County. So there is a district called the Freedom District named for the freed slaves who initially populated it. And as late as 1946, there were other events and organizations that were less than kind. And one of the past presidents of our local chapter, the NAACP, was 11 years old, and he defied his parents. And he set out on his front porch in 1946 with a shotgun, because on Fridays and Saturday nights, Klansmen would ride through the Johnsville and other small black communities, and at dark would shoot down anybody they saw. And his act of defiance and courage was to defy his parents and sit out and wait for them. And that was right in the Freedom District. So the district might be named for freedom, but as we all know, freedom isn't free.
Well, I wanted to ask you again, could you fill me in on where you find such a rich body of information? If anybody's motivated to try to follow up on any of the information you've shared with us today, where would they go to look? How would they do that process?
Well, they could go to Annapolis, to the state archives, where there are microfilm records of the newspapers of the day, or they could go on Main Street to the Carroll County Historical Society's library, where they have an exhaustive collection of the newspapers of the era, the Democratic Advocate and the American Sentinel, and plus many other newspapers from different towns.
Yeah. You had mentioned the Advocate and the Sentinel. They had their own sentiments, is that correct? They each had their own slant on
Very much so.
civic events?
Yeah, yes, very much so. The Democratic Advocate was frankly, as we would think of it today, a very racist, pro-segregationist paper, and would take every pain to humiliate or caricature blacks, even in the obituaries, and would be faithful in mentioning any obituary of any Ku Klux Klan member and who was there from the Klan and who gave the salute and all this. And the American Sentinel was essentially the Republican Party newspaper, a party that through its newspaper was very much a newspaper of public record and would cover black weddings, black funerals, white weddings, and white funerals equally and eloquently. It's hard to find references in the text of the Democratic Advocate to blacks that is anything less than demeaning, looking at it from our perspective today. But there were two cultural and two politically warring newspapers, and as a matter of public record, the American Sentinel died in around 1928, and the Democratic Advocate went on.